4 weeks now, tensions have exploded onto the streets of Georgia. What first appeared to be protests over a controversial new law have quickly morphed into something far larger, a national eruption of resistance against a Kremlin-backed power grab. At stake is nothing less than Georgia's political future, and now, Vladimir Putin's greatest fear is coming alive before our eyes. In truth, the protests are not just about a piece of legislation. The bill in question is merely a pretext. At their heart, the demonstrations are a reaction to Putin's push to politically subsume Georgia, to draw the country from its European trajectory into the orbit of the Russian state. For years, Georgia was Europe's most promising candidate to join the European Union. But over the last 2 years, the ruling government has been pulling it toward the Kremlin. That pull is now being met with massive resistance. Last night, tens of thousands of Georgians flooded the streets. They deflated Ukrainian, Georgian, and American flags in front of government buildings, a dramatic symbol. Many see the American flag as a representation of freedom itself. And in this moment, that message is being deployed as a weapon of protest. Things turned violent yesterday. After more than 300 days of largely peaceful demonstrations, a faction of protesters attempted to storm the presidential palace. The leadership of the movement, including a former Georgian president now acting as a symbolic figurehead, claims that the attack was a false flag operation orchestrated by the government, a contrived pretext to justify a crackdown. Whether that's true or not, the result is that tensions may spiral in the days ahead. To make sense of what's happening now, we need to rewind. Russia and Georgia share a long and troubled history, and the roots of today's crisis stretch back decades. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Georgia gained independence, but only briefly. In 1921, despite Russia's prior recognition of Georgian sovereignty, the Soviet army invaded. Tbilisi fell, and Georgia was absorbed into the USSR. For 70 years, it remained under Soviet domination. Only with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did Georgia reclaim its independence. But Moscow didn't simply relinquish its influence. Throughout the 1990s, Russia-backed separatist movements in Georgia's regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, often deploying troops under the guise of peacekeeping. This cultivated a fractured Georgia, vulnerable to external interference. In 2008, those pressures burst into open conflict. Russia launched a full-scale invasion into Georgia, ostensibly to protect Russian-speaking populations. It was the first major Russian military assault in the post-Soviet era, a precursor to similar tactics in Crimea and Ukraine. Putin had shown the world that military force remained part of his toolbox. But military invasions are costly and risky. Over time, the Kremlin shifted towards softer, subtler methods: political infiltration, media manipulation, and financial influence. That's where things get dangerous, and that's what we're seeing now in Georgia. Enter the Sogno Georgiano Party, Georgian Dream, founded in 2012 by a wealthy businessman whose fortunes were deeply tied to Russia in the post-Soviet era. In Russia's system, the rule is, your money is Putin's money, and if you hope to keep it, you must align with the Kremlin. That alliance paid off. In the very year it was founded, the party won Georgia's elections and assumed power. Over the years, it has enjoyed uninterrupted rule, aided by money, propaganda, clerical support, and the machinery of influence. On the surface, the party professed strong pro-EU sentiment. In 2012, about 80% of Georgians supported European integration, and Sogno Georgiano rode that wave of popular ambition. But once in power, the promises faded. For a time, the government did manage to push reforms that aligned Georgia more closely with European institutions. But the deeper the country moved toward Brussels, the more the Kremlin sought its hold. And when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the balance shifted dramatically. That's when the ruling party resurrected a notorious tool from the Putin playbook, a foreign agents law. Critics dubbed it the Russian law. If passed, it would require any NGO or independent media outlet that receives over 20% of its funding from abroad to register as a foreign agent, to be treated as though they represent external interests. The Ministry of Justice would then monitor them, demand sensitive disclosures, and impose heavy penalties or even prison terms for non-compliance. Opponents say this is no transparency measure. It's a weapon for surveillance and repression. It stigmatizes dissent and invites intimidation. If you fail to register, you could be fined as much as $3,600 or even imprisoned for up to 5 years. Even small errors, like missed filings, could land you behind bars for 6 months. The state could demand personal data, political views, ethnicity, religion, private life, everything. Russia used this same law in 2012 to decimate civil society in Russia itself. After the 2011 Duma protests, the Kremlin systematically deployed laws to choke off opposition. Eventually, the European Court of Human Rights determined those laws violated human rights. But by then, the damage was done. The regime had crushed dissent. Now, Georgia faces the same model. In 2023, Sugno Georgiano attempted to pass the law. Protests forced it to withdraw. But once Georgia obtained EU candidacy status, the party reintroduced the law with hardly any changes, banking on Brussels being too distracted to act. And in October 2024, parliamentary elections sealed their precarious control. But election night was chaotic. Videos emerged showing suspicious ballot stuffing. The sitting president refused to validate the outcome. Parliament promptly removed the president. In Georgia, presidents are selected by parliament, not via popular vote. A new parliament was seated, aligned with Sugno Georgiano, and a new president installed. Then, in November, they announced they would suspend EU accession talks until 2028, shocking most Georgians, since 80% still support EU membership by constitutional mandate. The protests followed immediately, sustained now for nearly a year. Sugno Georgiano, in coordination with the Kremlin, has tried everything to stifle dissent: regulatory harassment, fragmentation of protest planning, repressive policing. But the people have not backed down. I spoke with Professor Michael Clark, who recently visited Georgia. His words carry weight.
This movement is vigorous, but the Georgian government knows how to silence it. They make protests expensive, cost people their jobs, medical access, services. You don't need mass arrests. You just use laws, small sentences, subtle pressure. Social media censorship, threat of fines. It all wears people down.
He described how repression needn't be brutal. You don't need tanks or mass incarceration. You apply pressure gradually. 2 weeks in jail, loss of employment, legal fines, control over civic space. Over time, people are cowed, discouraged, and silenced. And the most vulnerable in these situations tend to be young, unaffiliated, not yet anchored to families or careers. They can endure the pressure others can't. This brings us back to today. The protests are surging again, despite attempts to stifle them. Now here's a question to you watching this. If your government tried to pass a law to label every NGO with foreign funding as a traitor, would you stay silent or take to the streets? That's the sort of moment Georgia finds itself in now. The odds seem overwhelming, but the people are pushing back, and they're pushing hard. Putin is watching. If he can succeed in Georgia, the consequence isn't confined to this small Caucasus country. It's a demonstration of power, a signal to other nations that dissent can be muted quietly, and independence can be bought politically. That's why this crisis matters, not just to Georgians, not just to Europe, but to anyone who believes in self-determination. Here in the 21st century, the Kremlin has learned to wage war not only with tanks and soldiers, but with institutions, influence, and legislation. Georgia is the crucible of that experiment. If it fails, Putin's reach extends further.